Today's show is about a Los Angeles institution and a source of local pride, nurtured to greatness as a family-owned business that was bought by someone from out of town who knew little about that business, put up little of his own money, and ran the property into the ground so that it is now a shell of its former self and, in fact, in bankruptcy. And with that turn of events, many customers have reacted by not buying the product. Nope, we're not talking about the Dodgers. We're talking about the Los Angeles Times. Am I the only one that sees the remarkable parallels in the road to ruin of two long-time emblems of Los Angeles excellence? After the Tribune Company bought Times Mirror, James O'Shea was sent to L.A. by the Tribune Company to run the Times. Sam Zell bought the Tribune Company in a deal that even I, no financial expert, thought was both bad and doomed. And soon the Times was, as I said, in bankruptcy and still is. O'Shea refused to do his boss's bidding in terms of cutbacks, and he was let go. Over the next 2 years, the Times cut nearly 40% of its journalists. James O'Shea has since founded the Chicago News Cooperative, of which he is editor, attempting a new model of journalism. James O'Shea is editor and co-founder of the Chicago News Cooperative, former editor-in-chief of the L.A. Times, and past managing editor of the Chicago Tribune. Under his leadership, the Tribune's news staff received 6 Pulitzer Prizes. O'Shea is also the author of The Daisy Chain, about the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, Dangerous Company, an examination of management consultants' role in corporate decision-making, and his latest, the one we will be talking about today, The Deal from Hell, How Moguls and Wall Street Plundered Great American Newspapers. Welcome, James O'Shea.
Oh, thank you, Terrence.
I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So why did you get into journalism in the first place? And do you think that you might make a different career choice if you were starting out today?
Well, I think I got into journalism because my grandfather was a born storyteller, and from an early age, he would sit around and tell me all these stories. He was a railroad man, and he would tell me all these stories about he and his buddies and going to the racetrack and doing all these things. And I really enjoyed storytelling and listening to him, and I think it kind of rubbed off. And as I got older and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, I decided to explore storytelling and started off actually in creative writing in college. And I had a great professor who basically said to me, I think you got a good touch for this sort of thing. And probably the first time that I was told that I could really do anything well in my life. And so I started exploring it, and I really kind of got into journalism itself in the Army when I was in the infantry. And I had been sent to Korea, and I thought the infantry was frankly pretty boring unless somebody was shooting at you, and they weren't there. So I decided to look around, and I found a job on the staff newspaper at the 7th Infantry Division. And that really, after that, I found the love of my life, which was journalism, and I stayed in it. And as far as today is concerned, there are a lot of different challenges, but yes, I'd do it again. I had a great career. I was very fortunate. But would I do it again? I think so. I think because, I sat back when I was actually at the L.A. Times and was trying to figure out what to do, and I thought, well, what has survived all of the turmoil that this industry has been through since Gutenberg invented the printing press? And, you look at television coming along and the Internet coming along and radio, and it wrought great changes in the American media landscape. But one thing has always survived, and that is storytelling, good storytelling. People will always read or listen or view a good story. And I don't think that's any different today than it was before. The means by which you tell it are different, but the true, really guts of it all is the ability to tell a good story. And if a journalist or a younger person today wants to be a journalist, I think they have to master that art of good storytelling, and they will survive.
Very good. Let me jump right into that. I actually do a lot of work with organizations, mostly nonprofits and foundations, in which I work with them on their storytelling. And one of as you were speaking, I realized one of my slides that I use says that really good storytelling you build up detail, 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 and you have to stick around to the end to find out what happens. And I make the contrast with journalism. And I say, the journalistic model is that you start out in the top of the story, giving them what happened, and if the reader decides they want to stick around for the details, you lay those in later. I guess what makes what you say true and what I say true is that we're not being quite so precise about the nature of storytelling, and still a good bit of journalism, even if it has to give away the ending in the first paragraph, is still going to grab you and you'll want to stick around.
Yeah, I think so. Part of it is the medium in which you're expressing yourself or which you're using. I think people come to a newspaper, for instance, with different expectations than, say, the New Yorker magazine. You are ready to sit down and read a long, carefully crafted story in which you're not supposed to tell everybody what happens until the end in the New Yorker. In a newspaper, you're kind of looking for that quick read. And so the storytelling in it is different, but the result isn't really that much difference. It's just really the medium itself, in the McLuhanish kind of way it's what sets the level of storytelling and the kind of storytelling you do. And so when you pick up a newspaper, at least when I do, I'm looking at it in a different way. Even within the pages of the newspaper, the old Wall Street Journal, you could read those little shots of what's going on around the world, those brief paragraphs, but you also look for the longer kind of good read on the page. And I think, that the sophistication of that's where editing and reporting comes in, and that's where I think, the building blocks of a good storytelling are different for each medium, but the end result is the same. It's a good story.
And the newspaper also has that range of stories, as you pointed out with the Wall Street Journal, where I think the contrast is the greatest to some extent. There are the one-paragraph things, and then the Wall Street Journal, its greatest I think that what it's known for the most, besides back when you used to have to go there to get the quotes and so on, is the long, long feature. And the Pulitzers and the prizes and those sorts of things are usually won for the features that actually divert from the who, what, where, when, and why in the first paragraph, correct?
Well, I think so, but, most of the time Pulitzer Prizes are awarded for really, great examples of in-depth reporting.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're in a investigative format where you go bang, 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 and there's your story. And sometimes it's just a very well-written story, well told. And so I think you get a little bit of both in that, but I don't think it's just limited to feature stories. I think the Pulitzers also represent recognition of some fantastic news reporting, too.
Let me approach this through your career. At what point did you begin to sense that the newspaper business was changing, that the income and the what it relied on for support was changing, even if, as we will talk about, the enormous profits during some of that stage may have masked that. But when did you get the sense that we were entering a new chapter?
It wasn't until pretty late in the game, I have to say. I think in the 90s, when the profits were high, I think everybody sort of thought things would just go on forever like that. And I didn't really focus. Part of the problem in journalism is that, newspaper reporters and editors were, for years and years and years, discouraged from the business considerations because, that was always, that's the business side's problem. And there was a kind of a wall between the editorial operations and the business operations and it was erected to protect the journalist from being influenced by business considerations, because if you knew, for instance, that a certain department store was a great big advertiser and meant a lot of money for your newspaper, would you be so willing to write a story that might anger them. So that wall was erected to kind of protect you from that kind of that sort of business consideration. And so a lot of journalists felt pretty comfortable with that because they didn't have to worry about who was going to generate the revenue to pay their salaries. They just basically went out and reported, and it was a pretty nice world. But then I think about in 2000, in the early 2000 period, maybe 2002, 2003, you began seeing that the advertising model erode. And at first it was gradual, and no one really kind of got alarmed. I don't think personally I became alarmed until, maybe 2004 or so. And I was in management, and I began trying to, and you saw this digital revolution coming, and I was very interested in how can you use that to tell stories better? How can you do that, to use that to improve your storytelling and your relationship with readers? And as I got into that, I began looking at the numbers that were available to me. I mean, I began asking questions. Frankly, the numbers weren't just flowing in all the time. But I began asking questions about, what is happening to our classified ad revenue, because it seems like it's going downhill. And, I guess that probably would have been in the 2002 range that you began seeing a real erosion and nothing on the horizon to replace it. And so I think that would have been the period of time when I began saying something's changing here that is far more fundamental than most journalists realize.
Right. And the sale of the L.A. Times or the Times Mirror Company to the Tribune Company was right during that period, yes?
It occurred in 1999. That's when, and then the first discussions about a potential deal occurred in 1999. I think the deal closed in 2000.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So what I'm thinking is that the Chandler family was having their misgivings already, because that's the only reason that sale ever went through, isn't it?
Yeah, they wanted to basically they felt that the Times Mirror had reorganized itself into too much of a newspaper company. And here was the Tribune Company that, frankly, was on the vanguard of a lot of the synergy and all of that sort of thing, and owning television stations. And the Tribune, under the leadership of Charlie Brumback, really was one of the first newspapers to begin exploring the Internet and websites and all that. So they saw this as a more progressive company and a way to change the nature of their investment in Times Mirror.
Okay. I'm speaking with James O'Shea, former editor-in-chief of the L.A. Times, about his book, The Deal from Hell. Now, it's about that period, I think, that I recall hearing the earliest talk of cuts, early retirements. Friends of mine, begin telling those stories because it was happening around them in the newsroom. And then I looked and I saw that newspapers were still earning 20% profits. And I thought, That's a pretty healthy profit margin. Couldn't something like a newspaper dealing with such an essential public service survive at maybe 10% or something? So I thought there was a lot of room. What was going on at that point? How were they able to keep the profit margins as high as they did when the ad revenues were already starting to fall? Was that the role the cuts played?
Yes. I mean, basically, when you looked at the Times Mirror, when the Tribune came in 2000, there were a lot of duplicate functions that could be cut.
By duplicate, you mean not that the Times Mirror had redundant functions, but suddenly you had two companies do that.
Yeah, you put two companies under the same roof.
Right.
So you had two HR departments, you had two accounting departments, and there were savings that could be achieved, particularly in printing functions too, in the printing plants. In the Tribune, people were what I would call good executors. They came in and they could execute a strategy as long as somebody gave them the strategy. So they came in and they achieved enormous savings in printing functions. And you could all of a sudden, you had one entity buying twice as much newsprint, so you could strike better deals there, so you could save money there. You eliminated quite a few business functions and eliminated the people with them. And so at first you put these two together and you could cut cost and maintain your margins. And that's what they did.
And because I think this is something that gets left out a lot, tell us a little bit about whether it's changed since then, but the amount of cost of a newspaper that's involved in printing, delivery, etc., and the amount that's in the newsroom.
Yeah, that is something that people overlook. And when I was editor of the Los Angeles Times and when I was managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, the amount of our revenues dedicated to producing the news was relatively small, maybe in the 10 to 15% range, 10 being the lower end and 15% being the higher. So the rest of that, was really dedicated to the biggest cost of a newspaper. And people tend to forget, but a newspaper is a manufacturing operation, and you have to take ink and paper and printing presses and trucks, and you put all of that together, and you have to produce a newspaper and deliver it to everybody's doorstep the next morning, at preferably before they leave for work. And you charge, really a very small amount of money for it. I think at the time the LA Times was 75 cents, which was, far less than it cost you to buy a cup of coffee in the morning. So you got a great bargain there, but the trouble was it was costing them a lot more than 75 cents to deliver that to your doorstep, because the biggest cost in it is printing the paper and delivering it to your doorstep.
So when we look,
that is a cost that is at a certain point you can't lower it that much.
That's what I was going to ask you, by the way. You said that the Tribune Company was good at making some savings in that area. What we've heard about over, now we're talking, really about 10 years here, we've heard about the cuts in the newsroom, the closing of bureaus and so on. How much have newspapers been able to save in the manufacturing of the newspaper and the delivery of the newspaper? And as you say, that one has a limit.
Well, yeah, it does, because it's certain. You can do all kinds of things. You can try to increase you decrease the size of the paper,
which the LA Times has done, and we don't mean the number of pages. We mean the width and the height, right?
The width and the height. You also cut the number of pages. You can do that. You can do all sorts of things, but you get to a certain level where you just can't go any lower, because you have to print it and deliver it to somebody's door every day. That's your contract. That's what you tell them you're going to do.
And you can't outsource it.
No, you can. You can do some outsourcing, but most of the time that's marginal savings when you're looking at the cost of your product. And so
you cannot have a newspaper printed in India.
No, you can't.
You can't do that.
Actually, you can probably have a lot of the technology, but the physical printing would have to be in the United States. So you get to a certain point, and then you look at the newsroom and you say, well, we've cut as much as we can, and now we have to go at the newsroom.
Yeah.
And I think that level, that began occurring in around 2003, 2004. You began seeing, periodically we'd always have cuts. As long as I was a manager in operation, you were wrestling with the cost of your editorial operations, because you always had people saying, well, why do you need a bureau in India? Can't we take that off of the wires? And, I would argue back and say, no, you want to have someone in India so you can actually, the editor in the newsroom is directing the coverage rather than some editor sitting in New York working for the AP. So, but at a certain point, I think it was about 2003, you begin seeing a lot more pressure to cut in the newsroom.
One other thing, most of the early talk, this is again as someone, sort of watching it but not inside of it, about the threat of the Internet seemed to be about the loss of readers to a system that could deliver information in a much more timely fashion. I don't recall in the early stages folks talking about the loss of classified ad revenue. But that was, of course, a much bigger financial threat, wasn't it? When did they first realize that was happening?
Oh, that was happening in the late 90s. You began seeing it occur with, you've had threats to classified advertising for a long time. You had threats to another great source of revenue for newspapers, which is pre-printed inserts, the kind of big package of ads you get in your paper.
Sure.
There were other companies that were coming along and starting to do that. But the real threat with classified began with the Craigslist of the world, when they began publishing free classifieds, and newspapers really were very slow to respond to that. and when they did, they usually did so inadequately. And so that began, I would say that began in the late 90s, early 2000s. It began accelerating, and it just got, it accelerated more quickly as time passed.
Yeah, in terms of storytelling, it's kind of a poignant point you make in the very first chapter of the book, where you have your big honchos from Times Mirror and Tribune Company, and they don't realize, or it's not necessarily they don't realize, but you contrast them with these couple of guys starting Google and this guy in his apartment starting Craigslist, and that this, the threat seemed so different from the enterprise.
Well, it was an amazing thing because the timing was so incredible. At the very time they were at a newspaper convention in San Diego, talking about, in the audience, you had people warning them that changes were coming and big deals, that we have to. They were really worried at that time about Microsoft, and Microsoft had a software program called Sidewalks, which was a threat to local coverage, and so they were worried about that, and they were all talking about, we got to get together and we got to figure out how to combat this. And here you have, literally right up the coast, 500-600 miles up the coast, a couple of kids who were starting Google, and you have Craig, the guy who was Craig Newmark, who started Craigslist. He had filed to become a registered as a for-profit company at the very time that this is all occurring. And instead of kind of looking at that and saying, "Oh, what are we going to do?" They're talking about buying each other, and I thought that was a really interesting contrast.
Yeah, you say that in 1999, Robert Cawthorn from the Arizona Daily Star warned the whole industry at a speech at the NAA convention in San Diego. This is the one you're talking about.
Right.
And he was saying, if I'm not mistaken, we've got to get together, and yet the companies, and you point out there were basically 9 big newspaper companies, they weren't about to band together. They were into competing and buying and that sort of thing.
Yes, at a certain time, it was the Tribune Company actually led the charge to create a pool of content in which all the newspapers would send their copy into this great pool, and they would charge for it and put it behind a paywall. And frankly, had that been done, and there were all kinds of antitrust problems and all sorts of things that they would have had to have overcome. But had they explored that and had they done that, it's unclear that Google would have been able to get all that content that they began putting on the internet for free. And so the whole game could have changed. Now, that's not to say that this was a great idea or that everybody had figured it out, but they didn't even want to walk in that direction. They all decided that they were not going to. They were too competitive. I mean,
yeah.
You have the New York Times saying, "Well, I'm not going to put my copy in a pool with the Chicago Tribune," or the L.A. Times is trying to figure out how they can get a hold of all of it. So it was one of those situations that it was really interesting because this occurred in the late 90s, and if they'd have even thought about doing that, the whole game would have been changed. But they didn't.
And when you say that, James O'Shea, what you're saying is that if the precedent had been set, and it had been set, as I think you're talking pretty much across the board, that newspaper content is going to be online, you're going to get convenience, you're going to get timeliness, but you're going to have a different kind of browsing, but you're going to pay for it. That if they'd all done it at once, that model would have been accepted? That's your intuition?
I think it would have been accepted eventually. It would have depended on how you would have done it. But yes, I think so. I mean, I think the real thing that people overlook here in looking at what happened in newspapers is it's very interesting. You had your real monopoly was in the ad markets and your ability to control access to your classified ad markets. So if somebody wanted to come into Chicago and its suburbs and advertise in the best zip codes, the newspaper was about the only one who knew where those people lived. And so you could come in, and they had created zoned advertising. So if I wanted to advertise my Chanel fragrances to people that lived on the North Shore of Chicago that could afford it, the Chicago Tribune could arrange that. And so they began relying on that kind of access in the market for 80, 90% of their revenue. Circulation, or the amount they charged for the newspaper, was only 10 to 15% of the revenue. And they became married to that kind of revenue. And what happens in the 90s is people come along and start saying, you got to change this. You got to become less reliant on advertising revenue and charge for your content. And there was resistance to that idea, because everybody felt like the best way to get more ad revenue is to keep your circulation growing. And they were having trouble even keeping it at level at that point. And so there was great resistance to any idea that you would charge for content and thereby lower your readership.
Very good. Let's talk now about the deals, because really the book, The Deal from Hell, I assume although Sam Zell, I think, even termed his purchase of the Tribune Company as the deal from hell, you're talking about kind of the biggest picture, that the deal that the banks made, not just for these two companies, but the kind of way they've influenced the whole thing. But we're going to talk about two deals: the Times-Mirror merger, which really was a takeover by the Tribune Company, and then the Sam Zell purchase of the resulting Tribune Company. So first, briefly, the Times-Mirror purchase.
Yeah, I kind of said in the book jacket there that the Zell purchase was the deal from hell, but the Tribune Company made a stop in purgatory before that and bought Times-Mirror in the early 2000s. And that was they probably picked their timing was terrible. They bought it just about as the Nasdaq peaked, and we had a collapse in the market. The internet bubble burst, and then right after that there was 9/11, and so they paid a huge price, far higher than most newspapers had fetched, and thinking that they could wring these savings out of it and increase their revenue by becoming a much larger player on the national stage. So you could come in and say to an advertiser, we can sell you advertising, and so you can reach markets in the three biggest markets in the United States: Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York.
And New York was through Newsday, right?
Newsday, yeah. That really wasn't quite true, because Newsday was not in New York City. And it was in a suburb of Long Island. And so you really didn't have the three largest markets, because the Newsday didn't circulate that heavily in New York City. So, there was a little problem right there. Plus, advertisers really didn't buy advertising that way. I mean, they would look at it and say, well, why should I buy an ad for you guys to reach Chicago? I don't want to reach everybody in Chicago. I just want to reach the 20% of the richest people in this
right.
market.
In other words, the thing you pointed out before, that the thing that was newspapers' competitive advantage was the degree to which they were ahead of so many others in terms of localizing.
Right. And
so this national idea was a nice theory, but it wasn't what people looked to newspaper ads for.
It probably wasn't thought through as carefully as it should have been, and it never worked.
Did Times, one thing you point out is that the Times folks didn't anticipate that this was a Tribune takeover, and yet that is the way it played out?
Well, nobody called it. They called it a merger.
Right.
But in effect, what happened was the Tribune Company and the Chandler family kind of teamed up against the minority shareholders of Times-Mirror, and Tribune took it over and began running it. And they controlled the company, they controlled the board, and suddenly the pride of Los Angeles was owned by a bunch of people from Chicago.
Right, and I recall at that time exactly that feeling was if they needed to sell, why couldn't they sell to, and of course this came up when Zell bought again. Why couldn't they sell to Eli Broad or David Geffen or someone?
Yeah.
And keep it local. Obviously, same thing with the Dodgers, as I mentioned at the top of the show. Yeah. So, and as you say, part of what went wrong with that deal was just the timing.
Well, the timing, they had paid too much for it. But then as time, and actually at first it sort of worked, because the Tribune was very successful at taking cost out of Times-Mirror, because Times-Mirror was a bit bloated when they took it over. They did a lot on the business side. They didn't touch the editorial at first. They let the editorial newsroom remain pretty well intact. And I think it was probably in 2004, 2005, in that time range, a couple of things happened. One was that the big movie studios began advertising less because they were pulling back. And you had department store consolidation throughout the United States. And so suddenly, instead of having 3 department store advertisers, you only had 2 and then 1. And you also had, in the early 2000 time frame, there was a lot. The electronic boom was coming along. Everybody was buying cell phones, and so the technology manufacturers were advertising very heavily, and then that began falling off. And so as your ad revenue, and then you had Craigslist coming along, so all of a sudden your income, you're struggling to keep your income rising. At the same time, you've kind of run out of cost-cutting options outside of the newsroom.
Right, which goes back to that point we made earlier in our conversation, that you can only cut so much until you have to look at the journalism itself. And so at what point do those cuts start happening? Is it around 2004?
Yeah, it was 2004, 2005.
And are they happening at both newspapers at that point?
They were, although you didn't see it as much at the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune was a smaller, leaner paper. It had an editorial staff of just about, at the peak, I think, when I was there, just over 700, whereas at the L.A. Times, you had close to 1,200 people in the newsroom. Now, the L.A. Times is a unique newspaper. It covers a huge area. It viewed itself as the voice of the West. It viewed itself as a national paper competing with the New York Times, which had an equally large staff. And so they wanted, the feeling there was that, we're a national paper. We're the big guys on the block. You people from Chicago, you run a smaller paper. It does some good work, but it's nowhere near as classy a newspaper as the Los Angeles Times, and therefore, leave us alone. And there was a lot of, and the irony is that the people who were really kind of, who felt that way, were from Chicago. John Perner, who was the publisher out there, he was a Chicago Tribune guy. The 2 people who became editor and managing editor were both put in by the Tribune Company, John Carroll and Dean Baquet. So so it was the Tribune's own people telling him, wait a minute, you guys don't understand this market. We got a different situation here, and you just need to learn more about that and listen to us. And we're telling you that you really need to invest in content, and you really need to maintain this as a quality newspaper, because if you don't, they'll be hell to pay.
And this notion of a national newspaper, I would suppose that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the L.A. Times were the only ones that aspired to that, correct?
That and maybe USA Today had
USA Today in a different genre almost,
and
Christian Science Monitor in a very small way,
so they were the big papers,
right? Those 3, and yet if I look back over the years, I have always seen folks in L.A. subscribe to the New York Times. I don't think I've ever seen anyone in New York subscribe to the L.A. Times.
Right.
So
the New York Times, frankly, a lot of their headroads that they made into the L.A. market and the San Francisco market came when the L.A. Times began cutting back, and they had a fairly aggressive campaign to boost their editorial resources in California and to boost the amount of coverage they gave.
Yeah, no, that's been obvious, and I think I certainly see much more so now that notion that people will subscribe to the New York Times out here. So the deal, they start doing the cuts. They're getting pushback from transplanted Chicagoans that say the culture here is different, the paper's different, and so on. And when do you get sent out here?
That occurred in 2006. The tensions between Chicago and the local management escalated. In 2005, John Carroll stepped down as editor of the Los Angeles Times, in an interview, he told me he was afraid that if he stayed there, they wouldn't appoint Dean Baquet, his deputy, as the next editor, and so he left. And Dean Baquet becomes the editor, and the tensions between the Chicago and Los Angeles continued to escalate. And Dean Baquet was not a guy who was unwilling to cut the budget. He did make cuts. And he and I worked on things together. I as managing editor of the Tribune, and he as editor of the LA Times, or managing editor of the LA Times, trying to figure out ways, that we could do things better, because there were some good arguments. Did we both need 5 correspondents each in Europe? Couldn't we do with 8? And I would agree to cover one area of Europe, and he would agree to cover. Now, there were kind of sensible things that could be done to reduce cost, and we did. But where the big problems hit is that the cuts became the strategy instead of, should you cut your budget and then take the savings and invest them in the internet version of the newspaper. The Tribune was at that time run very centrally out of Chicago, and they were saying, no, you send that money to your corporate parents, the company that owns you, and we'll figure out what to do with it. And so all of a sudden you had a less autonomy in the management of the paper in Los Angeles, and the people in Los Angeles began rebelling. And at one point, Dean Baquet had made a statement about you can't cut your way to the future. I'm sorry, he had said that to them, and then his publisher Jeff Johnson backed him up, and he did it. They did it publicly in an article in the New York Times, and that article really incensed Dennis Fitzsimons and the people in Chicago who were then running the Tribune Company, and so they replaced Jeff Johnson with David Hiller, and then they asked me to come out and be the editor of the paper when David Hiller and Dean Baquet couldn't get along.
Okay, and so one thing I also hear in there is that it's a fight between Tribune Company and Times Mirror on what to do with savings you're making or money you're making, and yet it sounds like neither of them it sounds like the Tribune, it wasn't just the fight between the two papers, but that it sounds like they were trying to keep as close as they could to those rich profit margins rather than investing in the things that would help them transition to the new state of journalism.
Well, they were making some investments to try to improve the paper and improve the profitability, but the demands on the paper from Wall Street were enormous because Wall Street was used to these 25 and 30% margins.
That's what I'm thinking.
And when Tribune was really going strong, it was delivering them consistently.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you have, and part of it is that, the management probably should have went to Wall Street and said, look, we can't continue these margins. We really need to reinvest in our products so that we can keep going, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And everybody keeps living this fiction that you could generate these kind of returns, and they were simply impossible.
Right. Then things get more and more difficult, and now it becomes what leads to the need for a sale and what leads to the choice of Sam Zell's offer?
Well, the need for the sale occurred when the Tribune corporate brass and the Chandlers began disagreeing over many things, including how to refinance some of the company's operations. There were pretty intricate financial deals in which the Chandlers had some trust that they were trying to unwind and liquidate, and the Tribune was kind of was taking steps that they viewed as endangering their investment. So finally, they wrote a scathing letter that they filed publicly, criticizing the Tribune Company management and suggesting, that they should explore strategic alternatives. And that really literally put the company up for sale. And so originally, after that letter, the Tribune decided to see if they could sell the company, and so they sent out, they prepared a book in which investment bankers could look. It was publicly known that the company was for sale. More than 20 big investment firms took a look at it, and they just kept dropping off by the wayside. Big private equity firms and people like that. So it got down to the point where one of the only ones left standing was Sam Zell, who was in and out of this picture. He looked at it first and said they want too much money, and then when it didn't go well, one of the investment banks called him back and said, you might want to take another look at this. And that's when he entered the picture and began bargaining for the sale.
Okay, James O'Shea, we're talking about the book, The Deal from Hell. His deal really was a deal from hell. As I said, when I remember reading about it, I thought, gee, this seems crazy. So tell us how that happened. A couple of the factors are he creates an ESOP. And
right.
One of my questions that I want you to include in your answer here is, do employees get any say as to whether something becomes an ESOP? I don't remember that.
Well, what happened is he actually came up with a pretty ingenious financing scheme in which he combined this a kind of a tax-exempt corporation with an ESOP, in which that would save the company millions of dollars that they paid in dividends, in taxes. I'm sorry, and because it was an ESOP and would be owned by the company by employees, they didn't have to pay dividends to stockholders. So he had created some savings. Did the employees have any say in creating an ESOP? No. They created the ESOP on their own. No employee objected to it because everybody was kind of saying, well, this might be a good idea. And, at that time, too, we had all been struggling. All of us in the newspaper side of things had been struggling with this whole situation of declining revenues and cost cuts. And so here comes a guy, Sam Zell. He had just sold his commercial real estate arm to Blackstone, I think it was, for $39 billion, and it was this big deal, and everybody's looking at it like, well, man, this guy's got the Midas touch. Maybe he can figure out these problems. So we were kind of open to anything that anybody had to offer so that we could kind of get out of this problem we were in, which was this is going on, 4 and 5 years of constant pressure to cut. So everybody's looking at Sam Zell as a potential hero here. And so Sam comes along and creates this ESOP structure. Nobody says, let's not do that. And, a question did come up early on in there, would the ESOP have a board, and would employees be represented on that board? And, of course, they didn't have any employees on that board. They had bankers and Mr. Zell and some of his associates were on that board. So, and they had a bank called the Great Bank, which was supposedly looking out for the employees' interest. But there's a doubt about that. There was a lot of litigation about that, which recently settled by LA Times employees, in which they got, I think, $30-something million from a consortium of people who were involved in this deal because they felt that there was a lack of representation and a lack of scrutiny on employees' behalf. So, no, they didn't get any voice in whether there was an ESOP, and that was...
And it turns out and they didn't get any voice in the ESOP once it was set up, which really is, I would imagine that would have been a moment to make a demand whether you could have gotten it or not.
Yeah. Well, they would return back and say, the trustee for the ESOP is the Great Bank, and that will represent the employees' interest. And they have a fiduciary duty to represent the employees' interests, so this is no big problem.
Yeah. And the other thing that you point out, and you said it here as well, is that I have a feeling that given what was going on with the regular media companies, that you would, in a sense, project your image onto Sam Zell, that he's going to do things differently. He's not going to be tied to these old models. He's going to be a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, everybody kind of thought that. At first, everybody was looking at him like he's a rock star. Here's a guy who comes along. He's made billions of dollars. Is worth billions of dollars. And he is saying, you can't cut your way to the future. What was happening is we had a revenue problem, but we kept treating it like it was a cost problem.
Exactly.
The more we treated it like it was a cost problem, the worse our revenue problem was coming. was becoming. So he recognized that and said, we have to figure out a way to increase revenues. You can't just keep cutting cost and cost. There's no future in that. And when I take over, things will be different.
Right. I mean, I saw a quote when you spoke to the FCC in 2008. You said, I believe that when Sam Zell understands how asinine the current budgetary system is, he will change it for the better because he's a smart businessman. He understands the value of wise investment. A dollar's worth of smart investment is worth far more than a barrel of budget cuts. And that was in 2008.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I actually said that
but what happened was he may have even had those intentions, but what happened was he was just saddled with way too much debt. Again, he made, in some sense, the same error that the that the Tribune had made, right?
He had a lot of debt, and his timing was terrible.
Yep, which applied to both cases. Yeah,
and nobody knew. Really, there were some suspicions that we might be heading into a recession in early 2008, but we weren't there yet, and so no one really knew. And when Mr. Zell took over, his first inclination was, we have to do everything we can to make sure that our cash flow doesn't fall, because if it does, we'd be in real trouble. And there was a very narrow margin there for success. And if it fell just a little bit, you had a problem. So, and that was due to the level of debt that
right.
That
as I said, he put up very little of his own. It was a great deal of debt, as you point out. $283 million in bank fees to create this deal, the two parts of the deal. And as you say, that would have run the LA Times newsroom for close to 2 years.
Right.
Let me switch. We've got about 7-8 minutes left to what you're doing, and I really appreciate this depth that we've gone into about this, but your thoughts of where the future is. And here we are. We're in a recession now that is either going to get worse or it's going to very, very slowly get better. I mean, I think we're all adjusting to this is a new normal to some extent.
Right.
So how does that impact the future of journalism? And you can speak specifically about what you're doing at the Chicago News Cooperative, or where the models are that you think are the success for the future.
Well, I think right now, to just be totally upfront about this, I don't think anybody has figured out where we're going in the future. I think there are a lot of efforts like mine trying to figure it out, but I don't know of anyone right now that is working very well, including what we call legacy media. I mean, the media companies now are scrambling to try to find a way to deliver the paper online. The most promising thing is the iPad, which makes reading a newspaper quite easy. And so, if you can figure out a way to deliver that information, deliver your newspaper electronically, you eliminate the biggest cost you have. So I think what you will see in the future is newspapers will try to get more and more readers onto the Internet. You will see smaller papers. You will see probably at some point they're going to have to consider the frequency of delivery. Can you really afford to deliver a paper 7 days a week? Maybe it's just 5. Maybe.
And this all goes back to that point that we brought up earlier, which is that the big cost is the manufacturing of a daily and delivery of a daily newspaper.
And so
at one point, I saw a quote from you that said the papers have to get out of the paper business.
Right, that's true, and they have to get out of the paper, newsprint, and delivery business and into the electronic age, and they have to figure out a way. Then you can charge. You don't have to charge so much because you don't have that huge cost that you have to cover of delivering the paper. So newspapers have to figure out how to get onto the Internet with content that is unique, and that's not easy because you have a lot of people who are out there throwing out content. But one thing that people forget is that today, despite their troubles, newspapers are the ones that are still doing the really kind of basic work of journalism. They go into courthouses, they go into police stations, they cover legislatures, and their reports are put out online, and they're the basis for a lot of bloggers and other people who write about all this stuff. So it seems like there's more information than ever available, But in reality, there's not. It's just there are more people telling you about that information.
That's right. More people repackaging very often.
Repackaging and aggregating it, but the people who are doing the most of the bulk of the original reporting on this are still newspapers or legacy media, and as they decline, these people are going to, the aggregators and all that are either going to face the decision, we got to invest in some journalistic assets to begin originating content, or we're going to be in trouble.
Because one thing I just realized that you in what you said is that we think of Google News, for instance, as not only as using other people's content, but it isn't. They don't save money just because they don't pay for the originators of the content. They save money because they don't print a newspaper.
They don't print a newspaper. They don't employ reporters.
Yeah. I mean, but it's both.
They have some editors who basically take the copy and edit it into a more internet-friendly format. But, they don't. The Google doesn't employ a single reporter to go into a courthouse and find out and look through files and do those sorts of things.
I know that the New York Times attempted to charge for it's certain premium, right? You couldn't get certain op-ed editors, but they dropped that, right?
They dropped it because they were meeting resistance, particularly from the columnists but this was at a time when paid content wasn't such a foreign concept as it is. It was a much more foreign concept.
Right. But now, I realize what I said wasn't even quite. Didn't they recently institute the pay for content online thing?
They are experimenting with a method.
Yeah. I, who read the New York Times online every day, got something before the price occurred. I got an offer from, I think, Lincoln Cars that said, we'll offer you the first 6 months free if you'll accept a few ads.
Right.
And so, now the the Wall Street Journal does charge. Right. How is that working?
They've been able to they've been more successful than anybody because the information they deliver, financial information, is usually more valued by people who are in the business of making money through, managing money. So I think they've been more successful at that than others because they've got a different audience, and the people who want to buy that information are financial professionals. That's why Bloomberg's been so successful. They charge for, it costs you $18,000 to $20,000 a year to get a Bloomberg machine in your office, and they're booming. They're hiring reporters right and left because people are willing to pay for that information.
So when you talk, as you do, about communities of interest, that's the community of interest that is willing to pay.
Right. And so with the Chicago News Cooperative, the idea was, can you do on a local level, can you go in and begin covering education issues, for instance, on a very granular basis, do profiles of local schools, rank local schools? Can you go in and get some of the community involved in the coverage, reach out to the community and say, help us cover this, help us keep everybody posted on what's going on? And if you can, will people pay for that information? Will they help support you for a very nominal fee? Will they contribute to your cooperative? And then you have we call that a news interest network for education. Can you have a news interest network for politics? Can you have a news interest network for theater? Can you have a news interest network for art? And can you assemble an audience large enough that'll pay you enough to hire your reporters to go cover that? That's the basic concept of it.
And if people want to get a look at that, what's the website for that?
It's the Chicago News Cooperative.org.
Okay, and I know that you also have a deal with the New York Times that prints some of your Chicago-oriented content in their Midwest or Chicago publications.
Yeah, we produce 2 pages of Chicago news twice a week in their Friday and Sunday papers. Okay. And that circulates in the edition in the Midwest, most of which is in Chicago, and it's Chicago and Cook County.
Okay, we got to bring this conversation to a close, James O'Shea. Obviously, as you said, the questions persist, and the models will be attempted, and we'll see what happens. The book is The Deal from Hell, The website is thedealfromhell.com. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly, either at iTunes or at my website, TerenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're both the same website. You can find podcasts, articles, transcripts, and so on. You can also sign up there at my site or by emailing me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com to get a weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and some background on the issues. Finally, thank you to James O'Shea. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay.